A homeless woman pulled a stranger from a burning wreck on a rainy highway and didn't think twice about it. What she didn't know, the teenager she saved was the only son of the most powerful Mafia boss in Chicago. And the Mafia boss hadn't stopped looking at her wrist since. The storm hit Chicago like it had a grudge. Rain came down in sheets so thick that headlights barely cut through 10 feet of darkness, the kind of night where sensible people stayed home and locked their doors. But Marla Keane hadn't had a home in 3 years, so the storm was just Tuesday. She sat beneath the overpass on Interstate 94, wrapped in a plastic tarp she'd found behind a diner on Kedzie Avenue, eating half a gas station sandwich she'd been rationing since morning. Above her, the concrete bridge groaned under the weight of traffic and rain. Around her, the small world she had built, a sleeping bag, a duffel bag with 3 changes of clothes, a rusted metal pipe she kept for safety, sat exactly where she'd placed it. Marla was 41 years old. She looked older. Her face carried the kind of weathering that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with hard years. Her dark hair, shot through with early gray, was pulled back tight. Her eyes, dark brown, sharp, always moving, never fully rested, not even when she slept. She heard the convoy before she saw it. Not a sound you forget. 20, maybe 30 engines running close together, all moving fast despite the rain. Through the gap above the embankment, headlights strobed across the wet asphalt like a military procession. Black SUVs, big ones, armored by the look of how they sat heavy and low on the road, moving in a tight formation that didn't happen by accident. Money, she thought. Old money. The kind that doesn't like being seen. Then the lead SUV hit the standing water. At 60 miles per hour, it happened in under 2 seconds. The front wheels caught the flooded lane. The vehicle fishtailed left, overcorrected, and the rear end swung wide. The SUV behind it had nowhere to go. The collision was brutal, a sharp metallic crack loud enough to punch through the rain. And the third vehicle in line, a massive armored Suburban, went airborne off the concrete divider. It flipped once. Then again, then a third time, landing inverted on the shoulder of the highway directly beneath the overpass, 30 feet from where Marla was sitting. For exactly 1 second, everything went silent. Then the fuel caught. Orange fire bloomed from the undercarriage, and the smell of burning rubber and gasoline hit her instantly. Traffic in every lane screeched to a halt. People screamed from inside their cars, frozen, doing what people always do in disasters, watching and waiting for someone else to move first. Marla was already moving. She grabbed the metal pipe, scrambled up the embankment, and ran toward the overturned SUV without a single conscious thought about the fire. The heat pushed against her face as she got close. The driver's side was fully engulfed. She circled to the passenger side, dropped to her knees, and pressed her face against the cracked window. Inside, upside down, held in by a seatbelt, was a teenage boy. He couldn't have been more than 17. Dark hair plastered to his face, a thin trail of blood running from his temple across his cheek. Unconscious but breathing, she could see his chest moving. A silver chain with a heavy cross had fallen across his chin. His jacket was expensive. Everything about him was expensive. None of that matters right now. She swung the metal pipe. The window spiderwebbed on the first hit, caved in on the second. She cleared the remaining glass with her forearm, felt a sting she ignored, and reached in to unbuckle the seatbelt. The boy dropped, and she caught most of his weight, dragging him backwards through the window frame. He was heavier than he looked. She pulled him 10 feet, 20, felt the heat intensifying on her back, pulled harder, 30 feet, 40. The SUV exploded. The shockwave knocked her forward, and she went down on one knee, shielding the boy's body with her own as debris scattered across the wet asphalt. Her ears rang. Her left shoulder screamed. She sat up after 3 full seconds and looked back at the burning wreck. Nothing could have survived inside that. She checked the boy's pulse. Strong. Breathing. Steady. And sat back on her heels in the rain, suddenly exhausted in a way that went all the way to her bones. "You're okay," she told him, though he couldn't hear her. "You're okay." She didn't notice the black SUVs arriving at first, but then there were 2, then 10, then 30. Then so many that the entire interstate, every lane, both directions, as far as she could see, was sealed completely by identical black armored vehicles. Hundreds of them, appearing from every on-ramp and access road like they'd been waiting just off stage. Armed men in dark clothing fanned outward in every direction. Police scanners crackled from every side at once. Marla stood up slowly. A helicopter descended through the rain and landed on the empty highway median. The man who stepped out didn't run. He walked with the particular calm of someone who had learned long ago that the world waited for him. Late 50s, silver at the temples, a face like carved stone. Handsome once, hard now. He wore no coat despite the rain. He walked directly to the boy on the ground, knelt, and pressed one hand to his son's face with a tenderness that didn't match the rest of him. Then he looked up at Marla. She met his eyes and felt something cold move through her chest. Not fear exactly. Something older. The kind of recognition that lives in the body before the brain catches up. "You pulled him out," the man said. It wasn't a question. "He was alive," she said. "Seemed worth the effort." The man's eyes dropped to her wrist, just for a second. Then something happened in his face. Color draining, jaw tightening, a crack appearing in that carved stone expression before it sealed itself shut again almost instantly. He was staring at her bracelet. Silver, thin, with a single small charm, a bird with its wings folded. He stood slowly, turned to the large man at his shoulder, and spoke 4 words so quietly that only the rain should have heard them. "Find out who she is." Marla heard them perfectly. She had always had very good hearing, and for the first time in 3 years of carefully staying invisible, she felt the specific chill of being seen, not as a homeless woman who did something brave on a rainy highway, but as something far more complicated, something someone had been looking for. She gripped the pipe at her side and said nothing. The highway blazed behind her. 1,000 black SUVs stretched into the dark in every direction, and the most dangerous man in Chicago was staring at her wrist like he'd just seen a ghost. Which, in a way, he had. They didn't ask her to come with them. They just made it very clear she had no choice. 2 of Dominic's men appeared at her sides so smoothly it felt choreographed. Big, quiet, professional. Not rough with her, but close enough that the message landed without a single word being spoken. A 3rd man picked up her duffel bag from the embankment without being asked, like they'd already decided she was coming and were simply tidying up the details. Marla considered her options in about 4 seconds. Run? No, there were armed men in every direction and nowhere to disappear to on a sealed interstate. Fight? With a metal pipe against 50 trained guards, that was just a slower way to lose. Scream for help. Every police scanner in a 2-mile radius was already answering to Dominic Moretti. She went with them. They put her in a black SUV that smelled like leather and gun oil. Nobody spoke during the drive. Dominic rode in a separate vehicle ahead of them, and she watched the back of his convoy through the tinted windshield, thinking. The bracelet on her wrist felt suddenly heavy. She'd worn it so long she'd stopped noticing it. 3 years of sleeping under bridges and eating leftovers, and it had stayed on her wrist through all of it, a habit she'd never let herself examine too closely. She was examining it now. The motel they brought her to had no sign out front, just a building off a side road in South Chicago, the kind of place that rented by the week and asked no questions. Except tonight, it had been emptied entirely. Dominic's men had cleared every other guest out before she arrived. 2 guards outside her door, 2 more at the end of the hall. A clean room, fresh towels, a paper bag of food on the small table, a very comfortable cage. She tried leaving the next morning at 6, opened the door, said she was going for a walk, and one of the guards simply stepped into the doorframe with a polite expression that meant, "Absolutely not." She tried again at noon through the window at the back of the bathroom, got as far as the parking lot before two men materialized from behind parked cars, like they'd been planted there specifically for this. They escorted her back without a word. That was somehow more frightening than if they'd shouted. What Marla didn't know was what was happening 3 miles away, in the private hospital where Cassian Moretti had woken up. He had a mild concussion, 4 bruised ribs, and a cut above his left ear that required 11 stitches. The doctor said he was lucky. Cassian, 17 years old and raised inside one of the most feared criminal organizations in the Midwest, had a complicated relationship with the word lucky. But he kept thinking about her. The homeless woman who ran toward an exploding SUV, who dragged him out without hesitation, shielded him with her own body when the fuel tank went, and then just sat in the rain next to him like it was nothing. He'd seen men twice her size back down from half that kind of heat. He'd grown up around people who calculated every risk before they moved a muscle. She hadn't calculated anything. She'd just moved. He asked his father's men where she was. They said she was safe and comfortable, and that was all he needed to know, which meant his father was already pulling the thread on whoever she was. Cassian had seen that look on his father's face before, not the gratitude, but the thing underneath it, cold, focused, like a locked door with something important behind it. He'd learned young that when his father got that look, people's lives tended to change dramatically. He hoped hers changed in the right direction. Back in the motel, Marla was watching the news coverage of the crash on the small television mounted to the wall. Aerial footage of the highway, the burned-out wreck, the hundreds of black SUVs still visible from the helicopter shot. A reporter called it a multi-vehicle accident involving private security personnel. No mention of the Moretti name. No mention of her. She turned it off when her hands started shaking. The panic attacks had started 2 years ago. They didn't announce themselves. They just arrived. A sudden tightening in the chest, the air going thin, her vision narrowing to a pinpoint. She sat on the edge of the bed, pressed her palms flat on her knees, and breathed through it the way she'd taught herself. Slowly. Counting. The footage hadn't scared her. What scared her was the man's face. The way he looked at the bracelet and then back at her with that fractured expression. Recognition and grief and something darker all tangled together. She'd seen that face before. A long time ago, before everything burned down, she had known a man who looked at her like she was the only fixed point in a spinning world. She'd spent 15 years making herself believe that man was gone from her life permanently, that she was gone from his. She was still sitting there, breathing carefully, when she heard the door handle move. Not one of the guards. The movement was different. Quieter, deliberate. Wrong. She was through the bathroom window before the masked men even got the door fully open. The cage, it turned out, had also kept other things out, and whatever was hunting her had just found the motel. She ran 4 blocks in the rain before a black SUV cut her off at an intersection. The window rolled down. It was one of Dominic's men, not a masked gunman, just a tired-looking guard with a radio pressed to his ear who said, "Mr. Moretti would like you to get in the car." Marla stood in the rain, barefoot because she'd left her shoes inside the motel room, breathing hard, and weighed her options. The masked men behind her, the SUV in front, the empty street on either side. She got in the car. Dominic was already inside, sitting in the far corner in the dark, watching her the way a chess player watches a board 3 moves ahead. He said nothing about the escape attempt, nothing about the barefoot running. He simply handed her a dry jacket and told the driver to head north. "Someone just tried to kill me in a motel you put me in," Marla said. "I know," he said. "They weren't my people." "That's supposed to make me feel better?" "It's supposed to make you understand that we have the same problem." She put the jacket on and said nothing for the rest of the drive. Milwaukee appeared 2 hours later through a gray morning, flat and quiet under a sky the color of old concrete. Dominic's convoy pulled into a residential neighborhood of wide lots and tall trees, stopping at a house that looked completely ordinary from the outside. Inside it was anything but. Reinforced doors, covered windows, a generator running in the basement, enough food stocked for 2 weeks. Cassian was already there, sitting at the kitchen table in a gray hoodie with 11 stitches above his ear, eating cereal like a normal teenager. When Marla walked in, he stood up so fast he knocked the bowl sideways. "You're the one who pulled me out," he said. "Sit down before you pull those stitches," she said. He sat, but he kept looking at her the way people look at something they're trying to memorize. Dominic disappeared into the back of the house with 2 of his senior men, leaving Marla and Cassian alone in the kitchen with the awkward silence of 2 people who had technically already been through something enormous together, but were meeting properly for the first time. Cassian slid the cereal box toward her. She was hungrier than she wanted to admit, so she took it. The bonding happened quietly, the way real things usually do. He asked if she knew how to cook anything, and she said she knew how to make whatever was in the cabinet stretch into 3 meals, which turned out to be a useful skill with Dominic's men cycling in and out at all hours. By the second evening, she'd shown Cassian how to make a proper tomato sauce from canned tomatoes and dried herbs, and he'd shown her how to set up the backup communication system in the living room, because he was bored and it gave his hands something to do. He put on old music while they cooked. Marvin Gaye, then some Sinatra, then something she didn't recognize that he said his mother used to play. She didn't ask about the mother. He didn't explain. But she noticed the way his jaw tightened when he said it. She recognized that tightening. She'd felt it herself for 15 years every time someone mentioned things she'd lost. She was careful with him after that. Not soft exactly. She wasn't built for soft anymore. But careful. He was 17 and had grown up inside something ugly and was trying, without the vocabulary for it yet, to figure out who he was outside of it. She understood that particular problem very well. What neither of them knew was what Dominic was discovering in the back room. He'd sent men to find Walter Griggs, a 70-year-old former accountant who had handled the Moretti organization's books for nearly 2 decades before disappearing into a quiet retirement in Wauwatosa. Walter opened the door, saw who was standing on his porch, and tried to close it again. Dominic's hand stopped the door politely but firmly. They sat at Walter's kitchen table, and Dominic asked him one question. What really happened to Vivian Hale? Walter was quiet for a long time, long enough that the refrigerator's hum became the loudest sound in the room. Then he talked. 20 years ago, Vivian Hale had been meticulous, sharp, and trusted completely inside the Moretti financial operation. Too sharp, as it turned out. She'd found inconsistencies in the books that didn't add up to accounting errors, money being siphoned, information being sold. Someone inside the organization was bleeding it from the inside, while enemies used that information to stay 3 steps ahead. Before she could bring it to Dominic, she vanished. Everyone assumed Dominic had her killed for knowing too much. Walter had assumed that too, had believed it for 20 years. "But you ordered it," Walter said quietly, not looking at him. "Didn't you?" "No," Dominic said. The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Walter finally looked up, and what he saw in Dominic's face wasn't the cold calculation of a man covering old crimes. It was something that looked uncomfortably like a man realizing, 20 years too late, exactly how completely he had been deceived. Someone else had ordered it. Someone who was still close enough to try again last night. Dominic drove back to the safe house in complete silence, and somewhere between Milwaukee and the driveway, the question stopped being, "Who is Marla Keane?" and became something far more dangerous. Who never wanted her found? Marla left at 3 a.m. No note, no explanation. She took her duffel bag, the jacket Dominic had given her, and the $40 she'd found in the kitchen drawer, which she told herself she would pay back, and almost believed it. The safe house had a blind spot in the camera coverage on the east side. She'd clocked it on the first day because clocking blind spots was simply how she moved through the world now. She was 2 miles away before anyone noticed she was gone. Detroit was 4 hours by the bus lines she knew, switching 3 times, paying cash, keeping her face angled away from station cameras out of a habit so old it didn't even feel deliberate anymore. She arrived just after 7 in the morning, when the city was still gray and half awake, and walked 11 blocks to a neighborhood where the houses sat wide apart, and the abandoned ones outnumbered the occupied ones. The church at the end of Aldrich Street had been closed for 6 years. The windows were boarded, the front doors were chained, but the side door, hidden behind an overgrown juniper bush, had a lock she had installed herself a long time ago, and the key lived on the same ring as the bracelet charm. She was inside in 30 seconds. The basement smelled like old stone and standing water. She counted 14 steps from the bottom of the staircase, turned left, found the loose panel behind the collapsed shelving unit, and pulled it free. The box was still there. Black metal, fireproof, the size of a shoebox. She'd put it here 8 years ago, the last time she'd been in Detroit, during one of the periods when a new identity had started feeling unsafe, and she'd needed to move everything important somewhere that wasn't on her body. She sat on the cold basement floor and opened it. Old photographs. 4 passports and 4 different names, 2 of them expired. $11,000 in mixed bills, slightly damp at the edges. A folded piece of paper with account numbers that probably led nowhere after this many years. And at the very bottom, wrapped in a square of black cloth, a necklace. She unwrapped it slowly. Heavy silver chain, a pendant in the shape of a crest, an eagle above 2 crossed keys. She'd seen it on letterheads, on rings, on the front gate of a house in Lincoln Park that she'd visited 100 times in another life. The Moretti family crest. She sat holding it for a long moment. Then she wrapped it back up and put everything in her duffel bag. "I figured you'd come here eventually." She was on her feet and turned around before the sentence finished. Cassian stood at the bottom of the basement stairs, hands visible, no jacket despite the cold, still wearing the gray hoodie with the stitches above his ear. He looked tired and quietly furious in the way that teenagers do when they've been frightened and are converting it to anger, because anger is easier to carry. "You followed me," she said. "You walked out without telling anyone. My father has people looking in 3 states right now." He looked at the open box, then at her duffel bag. "What is all that?" "None of your business. You're in my family's safe house, eating food we paid for, and someone is trying to kill you, and it's none of my business?" She looked at him. He didn't look away. Most adults looked away from her eventually. Discomfort, pity, guilt. Cassian just looked straight at her with those dark eyes that were his father's eyes, and waited. She sat back down on the floor. After a long moment, she told him. Not everything, but enough. She told him about the name Vivian Hale, about working inside the financial operations of a large and dangerous organization when she was 26 years old and good with numbers and dangerously naive about the difference between loyalty and survival. About finding things in the books that she wasn't supposed to find. About going to sleep one night feeling like she was doing the right thing and waking up in a burning car on a county road outside the city, half her hair gone, her left arm burned from wrist to shoulder, completely alone. About understanding in that ditch, bleeding and smelling like smoke, that whoever had put her in that car had access to things only a handful of people knew, and that going back meant dying properly this time. Cassian sat down on the bottom step while she talked. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, the basement was very quiet. "The necklace," he said finally. "The crest. That's ours." "Yes." "Which means you weren't just working for the organization." He said it slowly, working it out. "You were close to the family." She said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. He opened his mouth to ask the next question. The obvious question, the one hanging in the cold air between them, when the boards on the basement window imploded inward and two men in tactical gear dropped through simultaneously. Marla grabbed Cassian by the collar and ran. She'd found the tunnel access on her way in, an old coal delivery passage that opened into the storm drain network 2 buildings east. They were inside it before the third man made it down the stairs, pulling the access panel shut behind them, running bent double through the dark and water up to their ankles. Above them, she could hear boots on the church floor. Below that, she could hear her own heartbeat. And below even that, very quietly, the question Cassian hadn't gotten to ask yet. How close exactly had she been to the Moretti family? The answer was going to change everything. They made it back to Chicago by nightfall. Dominic met them at the estate gates personally, which Marla understood meant he was furious. He didn't raise his voice. Men like Dominic never raise their voices. They'd learned long ago that quiet was more frightening. He looked at Cassian for 3 full seconds without speaking, which by any measure was worse than shouting, and Cassian had the good sense to look at the ground. Then Dominic looked at Marla. "You have a death wish, or just very poor judgment?" "Neither," she said. "I had something to retrieve." "In Detroit, alone, while someone is actively hunting you?" "I've been alone for 15 years. I know how to move." Something shifted in his expression at the word 15, a small crack in the stone, there and gone. He turned and walked inside without another word, and his men parted like water around him, and Marla followed because she had the necklace in her bag and enough information to burn everything down, and she needed to choose carefully how she used it. The estate was something else entirely. She'd imagined it over the years the way you imagine places you've been deliberately kept from. The reality was larger, colder, and more like a fortress than a home. High stone walls, cameras on every corner, grounds that were immaculately kept in a way that felt less like pride and more like control. Inside, the rooms were expensively furnished and completely impersonal, like a museum that happened to have people living in it. The older staff recognized her. She saw it happen. A woman carrying linens in the hallway who looked up and went very still, then looked quickly away. A gray-haired man near the kitchen door whose eyes widened before his face went carefully blank. 20 years was a long time, but apparently not long enough to make Vivian Hale unrecognizable to people who had known her well. Marla kept walking and said nothing, but she catalogued every reaction. That was the habit. Catalog everything. Cassian found her on the east terrace an hour later, standing in the cold, looking out at the grounds. He handed her a cup of coffee without being asked, which she appreciated more than she showed. "They remember you," he said. "Some of them." "Does that scare you?" She considered the question seriously rather than deflecting it, which seemed to surprise him. "No," she said finally. "What scares me is whoever sent those men to Detroit knew exactly where I was going, which means they've been tracking my movements for longer than just the last few days." Cassian wrapped both hands around his own cup. "You think it's someone inside?" "It's always someone inside." He was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, like someone placing a foot on ice they aren't sure will hold, "What do you know about Sal Romano?" She turned to look at him. "He's been my father's underboss for 18 years, Cassian continued, "but I've been thinking about what he said the night of the crash, when my father first mentioned your name, your real name. Everyone else in that room went still because they were surprised. Sal went still differently." He paused, like a man hearing news he'd been dreading. Marla said nothing, but she turned back to look at the grounds with new focus, like someone who had just been handed the last piece of a puzzle they'd been carrying for 2 decades. What neither of them knew was that 40 minutes earlier, in a private room on the 2nd floor, Sal Romano had made a phone call. Sal was 63, broad across the shoulders, with a white beard he kept trimmed close, and small, careful eyes that had always reminded people of an accountant more than an enforcer, which was appropriate, because his real talent had never been violence. It was positioning. Knowing which way things were falling before they fell and making sure he was never underneath them. He'd been doing it for 30 years. The person on the other end of the call was not a Moretti captain. The voice was flat, professional, the kind that belonged to someone who treated violence as a logistics problem. "She got out of Detroit," Sal said quietly. "I know. She has the box, which means she has the records." A pause. "Then we're past the point of patience." "Dominic doesn't know yet," Sal said. "He suspects, but he doesn't have proof. If we move before she can talk to him—" "I'll handle the arrangements," the voice said. "You handle the narrative. If Moretti dies grieving a woman he thought was already dead, that's a clean story. People will believe it." Sal ended the call and sat for a moment in the quiet room, looking at his own hands. 30 years ago, he had made a single decision, to take what the organization offered and then take a little more on the side, quietly, carefully, just enough to matter. That decision had compounded itself over 3 decades into something monstrous and inescapable, the way small lies always do when you tend them long enough. Vivian Hale was supposed to have died in that car. The fact that she hadn't was the only mistake he'd ever made. He wasn't going to let it survive another 48 hours. At dinner that night, Marla sat 6 seats down from Sal Romano and watched him the way she used to watch the books, patiently, looking for the number that was slightly wrong, the entry that didn't belong. She found it before the main course arrived. The way he buttered his bread, left hand, deliberate, controlled, and his eyes never once drifted to her face the way everyone else's did. He wasn't avoiding her out of discomfort. He was avoiding her because he already knew exactly what she looked like. She put her fork down quietly. Outside, the first rifle shot took out the East Terrace floodlight. Then the second took out the gate camera, and the estate, which had felt like a fortress an hour ago, suddenly felt like a trap. They lost 3 guards in the first 90 seconds. Dominic moved like a man who had survived ambushes before, low, fast, giving orders in clipped sentences that his remaining men executed without question. Marla grabbed Cassian and pulled him away from the dining room windows before he could stand there being 17 and bulletproof in his own mind. They moved through the estate's interior corridors while gunfire cracked outside in short, controlled bursts. Professional, coordinated. Not a robbery, not a warning, an erasure. Dominic appeared at the end of the corridor with 2 men and a set of keys. "Move," he said. That was the entire instruction. They went through a basement exit Marla hadn't known existed, into an underground garage where 3 vehicles sat waiting, and were out through a tunnel exit half a mile from the estate before the attacking team had fully breached the main gate. Nobody spoke for 20 minutes. Then Cassian said from the back seat, "Are we going to talk about how they knew exactly which lights to take out first?" Dominic said nothing, but Marla saw his jaw tighten in the dark and knew that Cassian had just said out loud the thing his father had already understood and wasn't ready to speak yet. The cabin had belonged to Dominic's mother. It sat on the edge of a small lake in northern Michigan, 4 hours from Chicago, at the end of a dirt road that didn't appear on any navigation app and was deliberately absent from every property record connected to the Moretti name. His mother had bought it under her maiden name in 1987 and told nobody except Dominic, and Dominic had told nobody at all. Which meant Sal didn't know it existed, which meant, for the first time in days, they could breathe. The cabin was modest in the way that surprised people who knew what Dominic was worth. Wood-paneled walls, a stone fireplace, mismatched furniture that had accumulated over decades of quiet weekends. Photographs on the mantel of a younger Dominic with a small, dark-haired woman who had his eyes. A shelf of paperback novels with cracked spines. A kitchen that actually looked used. Marla stood in the doorway and felt something unexpected move through her. It looked like a place where someone had been genuinely happy. Cassian fell asleep on the couch within an hour, exhaustion and painkillers from his ribs pulling him under mid-sentence. Marla covered him with a blanket from the hall closet and stood looking at him for a moment. This boy who had grown up inside something corrosive and was somehow still trying to be decent, before she heard Dominic on the porch. She almost went to bed. Instead, she opened the door. He was sitting on the top step with a glass of whiskey he wasn't drinking, looking out at the lake. The water was black and perfectly still. The sky above Michigan had cleared completely, and there were more stars than she'd seen in years. She sat on the step beside him, not close, but close enough. For a long time, neither of them said anything. Then Dominic said, very quietly, "I thought you stole from me." "I know." "I thought you took the records and sold them and ran. For 15 years, I believed that." "I know that too." He turned to look at her. In the dark, without the armor of the estate and the guards and the machinery of who he was, he looked like what he actually was, a man in his late 50s carrying 2 decades of the wrong conclusions. "Someone handed me evidence," he said. "Documents. Testimony from 2 men I trusted. It was airtight." "Sal is thorough," she said. "He was my oldest friend. That's how he survived this long." Dominic looked back at the lake. "The car bomb. Were you—" "My left arm," she said. "From the wrist to the shoulder. I kept it covered for 3 years. By the time I stopped covering it, living outside meant nobody close enough to see anyway." Something moved across his face that she looked away from because it was too exposed to watch directly. "I spent a year trying to find out who ordered it," he said. "I thought it was a rival organization. I tore through 4 families looking for answers. And the whole time it was sitting at your own table." He was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you come back? After you survived, you could have found a way to contact me." And there it was, the question she'd been carrying the longest. She chose her words carefully because they were true, and true things deserved care. "Because I didn't know who I could trust," she said. "Sal had access to everything. My contacts, my roots, every identity I might run to. Every time I built something new, it eventually felt compromised. And because—" She stopped. "Because?" "Because you believed it," she said. "The evidence was fabricated and you believed it. And I understood why. Sal was careful and the evidence was good. But I still had to survive the part where the person I trusted most in the world concluded I was a traitor without asking me a single question." The silence that followed was the longest of the night. "I failed you," he said finally. Not a justification, not an explanation. Just 3 words placed down honestly, like something owed. Inside, Cassian slept on the couch. Outside, the lake stayed perfectly still. And somewhere between the stars and the water, something that had been broken for 20 years sat quietly in the darkness, not yet mended, but at least, finally, honestly, named. The coup started quietly, the way Sal did everything. 3 captains stopped answering Dominic's calls on a Tuesday morning. By Wednesday, 2 more had gone silent. Dominic's remaining loyal men reported whispers moving through the organization like smoke under a door. That Dominic had gone soft. That the return of a ghost from 20 years ago had broken something in him. That a boss who disappeared to a lake cabin with a homeless woman was not a boss who deserved the chair he was sitting in. Sal Romano was telling a very convincing story. He was good at stories. Dominic made a decision. The only way to stop a story was to replace it with the truth, and the only way to do that was in person, in front of the people who still mattered. He reached out to 7 captains he was certain of and arranged a meeting at Navy Pier, public enough that nobody would start shooting, private enough to have a real conversation. Marla spent 2 hours trying to talk him out of it. "Sal will know within an hour that you've called a meeting," she said. "He has ears in every room you've ever sat in." "Then let him hear," Dominic said. "Let him hear that I have the original records from 20 years ago, and that I'm ready to lay out exactly what he did in front of every man who matters." Marla looked at Cassian. Cassian looked at the floor. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that walking into a public meeting when your oldest enemy already knows you're coming is not a strategy. It's an invitation. Navy Pier on a Thursday afternoon was full of ordinary life. Tourists with children, a school group near the entrance, a food vendor arguing cheerfully with a customer about change. The meeting point was a private dining room above the waterfront that one of the loyal captains owned and used legitimately. Security was posted at every entrance. Dominic's men swept the room 40 minutes before arrival. Everything looked clean. It wasn't. The gunmen came from the waterside, which nobody had covered adequately because it seemed unreasonable. Boats pulling quietly up to the pier's underside, men climbing through maintenance access points, moving into position while the security sweep was focused on doors and corridors. Sal had always understood that people defend the doors they know about. The first shots hit the windows of the dining room, and everyone went to the floor simultaneously, the trained and the untrained alike, unified by the very basic human response to glass exploding inward. Tables flipped. A man near Marlowe went down clutching his shoulder. Outside in the corridor, Dominic's guards returned fire, and the pier erupted into the chaos of ordinary people running in every direction at once. Cassian pulled Marla behind an overturned table, and they stayed low while the room reorganized itself from a meeting into a battlefield. "Exit," she said. "My father is moving. Look." Dominic was crossing the room in a low crouch toward the service corridor, waving his men into a defensive formation with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been in worse rooms than this. He was almost to the door when the shot came from the left window, from an angle nobody had calculated because it required a shooter positioned on the pier structure itself 30 feet above the waterline. Sal had always been thorough. Dominic went down hard against the corridor wall. Cassian was moving before Marla could stop him. She went after him because there was nothing else to do, both of them crossing the exposed floor of the room while Dominic's guards laid down covering fire toward the windows. She was aware of bullets hitting the floor behind her in a straight line, like someone adjusting aim, and she moved left without thinking and pulled Cassian sideways with her. A gunman appeared in the service corridor doorway directly ahead. Cassian hit him before Marla could react. Not a calculated move, just the pure physics of forward momentum and desperation. The gunman went down. Cassian stood over him, breathing very hard, and she watched something move across his face. A kind of horror that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with the recognition of what he was capable of, what he'd just done, what it had felt like. She grabbed his arm and pulled. They got Dominic into the service corridor. He was hit in the side, below the ribs, bleeding heavily but breathing, conscious, furious in the particular way of men who are angry at their own bodies for failing them at inconvenient moments. He looked up at Marla while she pressed her jacket against the wound. Then he looked past her at Cassian, who was standing against the corridor wall with his eyes closed and his hands shaking. "Cassian," Dominic said. His son opened his eyes. "She never betrayed me," Dominic said, clearly, loudly enough for the 3 loyal captains who had made it to the corridor to hear. 20 years ago, Vivian Hale discovered a traitor inside this organization and was nearly killed for it. Everything that happened to her happened because of Sal Romano. He paused to breathe. That is the truth. Every man here is going to know it. The captains looked at each other. Then they looked at the door Sal had turned into a trap. The story Sal had been telling for 2 days started cracking down the middle. And in the service corridor beneath Navy Pier, with blood on the floor and the lake wind coming through the walls, the ending finally began. Marla was gone when Cassian woke up. Not vanished this time. Taken. The note had been left on the kitchen table of the safe house where they'd moved Dominic after the pier. 3 words written on a torn piece of brown paper, in handwriting that wasn't hers, which meant someone had written it for her while she couldn't object. Come alone. Warehouse. Below it, an address near the Chicago docks. Cassian read it twice, then looked at his father lying in the back room with a doctor leaning over him and 2 guards at the door. Dominic was conscious but pale, the wound packed and stabilized but not yet properly treated, running on stubbornness and anger in roughly equal measure. The doctor had been very clear that movement was not an option. Cassian folded the note and put it in his pocket. Then he went to find 3 men he trusted. The warehouse sat at the edge of the dock district, where the city stopped pretending to be anything other than industrial. Rust and salt air, and the sound of water hitting concrete in the dark. It was enormous, the kind of building that had once held shipping containers, and now held nothing except the particular emptiness of abandoned spaces that have forgotten their purpose. Sal had chosen it well. No cameras, no neighbors. No reason for anyone to come here at this hour, except the specific reason Sal had manufactured. He'd taken Marla 2 hours earlier, during the window when the safe house security was focused on Dominic's medical situation, and everyone's attention was pulled inward. 3 men, a car, and the confidence of someone who had been operating inside this organization long enough to know exactly when its eyes were elsewhere. He had her zip-tied to a chair in the warehouse's back office, which still had its walls and ceiling intact, while the rest of the building had been slowly decomposing for a decade. A single work light threw harsh shadows across the concrete floor. The metal box from Detroit sat open on the table beside him. He'd already been through everything inside it. "The records are incomplete," he said, more to himself than to her. He held up the folded paper with the account numbers and studied it with the expression of a man trying to assess exactly how much damage control was required. "These accounts were closed, the transfers rerouted years ago. This doesn't prove anything without the secondary ledger." "The secondary ledger isn't in the box," Marla said. He looked at her. "I know," she said simply. "Where is it?" She smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who had spent 15 years thinking about exactly this conversation and had made peace with all possible outcomes before it began. "It's in a format that broadcasts automatically if I don't reset it every 72 hours, she said, "which means it already started moving the moment your men put me in that car." Sal stared at her for a long moment. Then he set the paper down very carefully, which was somehow more frightening than if he'd thrown it. "You're bluffing," he said. "I've been homeless for 3 years," she said. "I've been running for 15. I've rebuilt my entire life from nothing 4 separate times. Do I seem like someone who didn't plan for this?" The silence that followed told her everything. He wasn't certain. And uncertainty in a man like Sal was more dangerous than confidence, because it made him accelerate. He stood up, and she heard him tell his men outside to finish it, and she closed her eyes for exactly 1 second, not from fear, but from the particular focus of someone narrowing everything down to what matters most right now. And then she started talking, loudly, clearly, directly to the phone she'd palmed from the guard who'd zip-tied her wrists, the screen facing upward in her lap, the recording function running. "Say it properly, Sal," she said. "You ordered the bomb on Vivian Hale's car 20 years ago. You've been stealing from the Moretti organization since 1994. You sold operational information to rival families and federal contacts in exchange for protection. You ordered the attacks in the motel, in Detroit, at the estate, and at Navy Pier. Say it." He crossed the room and grabbed her by the collar. "Say it," she said again, perfectly calm. And because he was furious and certain the phone was just a phone and she was already about to die anyway, he said it. All of it. In the flat, precise language of a man who had kept the secret so long that confessing it felt almost like relief. The door came off its hinges before he finished the last sentence. Cassian came through first, which was not the plan but was entirely predictable, and Sal's men were not expecting a 17-year-old moving that fast with that much anger behind him. The loyal crew came through behind him, and the back office became very loud and very violent in a compressed period of time that Marla experienced mostly from the floor, where she'd tipped the chair sideways to stay below the immediate chaos. She heard Sal shout, heard something heavy fall. Then she heard Dominic's voice. She turned her head, and he was standing in the doorway, gray-faced and bleeding through his bandaging, holding the doorframe with one hand and pointing at Sal with the other, with the absolute authority of a man who has nothing left to lose, and has therefore become the most dangerous thing in the room. Sal raised his weapon. Dominic didn't move. Cassian hit Sal from the side, and the gun went skidding across the concrete floor, and everything happened very fast after that. A struggle, a shout, the sound of metal on metal, and then Sal stumbling backward into the far wall where the old fuel drums were stacked and had been slowly leaking for longer than anyone knew. The spark from the metal floor was all it took. The fire moved faster than any of them expected. Marla was on her feet with her wrists still bound, and Cassian cut her free with a knife from the table, and Dominic was already pulling them both toward the door with a grip that belied the blood soaking through his shirt. They got through the warehouse door with 40 feet to spare. Behind them, Sal Romano made no sound that any of them heard above the fire. The warehouse burned against the Chicago skyline like a signal flare, orange light reflecting off the black water of the docks. And the three of them sat on the concrete outside catching their breath, while sirens began assembling themselves in the distance. Cassian looked at the phone in Marla's bound hands. "You got it all?" he said. She checked the recording. 41 minutes. Clean audio throughout. "I got it all," she said. Dominic looked at the burning warehouse for a long time. Then he looked at his son, and then at the woman sitting beside him who had survived a car bomb and 15 years of running and 2 days of being hunted, and had still, at the very end, been the calmest person in the room. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The recording broke everything open. Not all at once, not cleanly. The truth rarely arrives the way you imagine it will. Some dramatic single moment where everything resolves and everyone understands. Instead, it came in pieces, the way a building comes down after the foundation is pulled out. Slowly, then all at once, then just dust where something enormous used to be. The recording reached federal contacts through channels Marla had maintained for 15 years, quiet dead drops and encrypted transfers built into the same system that had kept the secondary ledger moving. Within 48 hours, 3 of Sal's captains were arrested. Within a week, federal investigators were walking through the Moretti estate with boxes and cameras. The organization that had taken Dominic 40 years to build began coming apart at the joints with the quiet efficiency of something that had already been hollow for a long time. Dominic let it happen. That was the part that surprised everyone who thought they knew him. He didn't fight the investigations, didn't disappear the evidence, didn't call in favors or apply pressure or do any of the 100 things a man in his position could theoretically do to slow the collapse. He sat in a lawyer's office in downtown Chicago and answered questions with a directness that his attorneys kept interrupting and he kept overriding. Cassian visited him after the second session and asked him why. Dominic was quiet for a long moment. "Because Sal was right about one thing," he said. "I had become the thing I built, and the thing I built destroyed everyone around me who didn't deserve it." He looked at his son steadily. "I'm not doing that to you." Cassian didn't have an answer for that, but he carried it with him. The weeks that followed had a strange texture to them. The violence stopped, immediately and completely, like a switch being thrown, because the structure that had organized it was dissolving. The remaining captains scattered, some arrested, some simply vanishing into the ordinary world, in the way that people who have spent years being dangerous sometimes do when the machinery that required their danger stops running. Chicago felt different. Or maybe Cassian just felt different inside it. He told his father 3 days after the warehouse that he wasn't staying. Not said it as rebellion or ultimatum, just stated it plainly, the way you state a fact about yourself that has become unavoidable. He was leaving Chicago. He didn't know where yet. He knew what he didn't want to become, and that was enough of a compass for now. Dominic had nodded slowly. "Your grandfather said something to me once," he said. "He said the most important thing a man can do is know the difference between what he inherited and what he chose." He paused. "I never learned that difference. I hope you do better." It was the most honest thing Cassian had ever heard his father say. He packed 2 bags. Everything he needed fit easily, which told him something about how lightly he'd actually been living inside all that weight. Marla went back to the bridge on a Wednesday morning in early November. She didn't entirely understand why. She told herself it was just to see it, to stand in the place where everything had changed and look at it in daylight without a storm and without fire and without the specific adrenaline of survival narrowing everything to the next 10 seconds. To see it as just a bridge. It was just a bridge. Concrete and steel, and the sound of traffic above, and the smell of the river nearby. The spot where she'd slept was bare now. Her sleeping bag and tarp had been cleared away the night of the crash, and she'd never returned for them. The embankment was just an embankment. The overpass was just an overpass. She stood there for a long time with her hands in her jacket pockets. 3 years she had lived here. 3 years of making herself as small and invisible as possible, eating what she could find, staying beneath the radar of a world she decided was safer without Vivian Hale in it. She'd been so focused on surviving that she'd stopped noticing she had stopped living. A car bomb had taken everything from her, but she had let the years take the rest. She heard footsteps on the embankment behind her and turned. Dominic came down the slope carefully, one hand touching the concrete wall for balance, his side still healing, wearing a plain dark coat she'd never seen before. Not the armor of who he was, just a coat. He stopped a few feet away and looked at the spot where she'd slept and said nothing for a moment. "How did you find me here?" she asked.
"I didn't find you," he said. "I came here because this is where I should have come to begin with. 20 years ago, 15 years ago, any point along the way." He looked at her. "I came to ask if there's any version of what comes next that has both of us in it. Not what we were, something different, something that isn't built on any of this." He paused. "I'm asking, not assuming, not arranging. Asking." Marla looked at him for a long time. Then Cassian appeared at the top of the embankment with both bags over his shoulders, looking down at them with the expression of someone pretending he hadn't been listening. "Are we going or not?" he said. "Because I have a bus to catch." Marla looked at Dominic. Dominic looked at Marla. Behind them, the city moved on the way cities do. Indifferent, continuous, already forgetting. The 3 of them walked up the embankment together and didn't look back. Not at the bridge, not at the wreckage, not at any of it. Some things you survive. Some things you set down. The hardest part is knowing which is which, and finding, against all reasonable odds, someone willing to walk away from it beside you.